So, as you said, my name's Taylor. It's actually going to be a Kramer takeover of the pulpit for a couple of weeks. My brother Harrison, who's up front here, is going to be preaching next week. And so my main goal today is just to make sure he has like more than 5 people to preach to next week. Try not to scare anybody away. But seriously, he is a great man of God, very insightful, 8 years younger than me. But I learn something from him every time we get together, and so I would encourage you to return next week to hear what he has to say. My name is Taylor. I have my expectant wife, Abby, over there. Our daughter, Flynn, is in the nursery. We originally came to this church, honestly, kind of as a favor to Anthony. We were in search of a church home. We had one that we were attending pretty regularly, but it hadn't yet felt like home. At that time, I was in the podcast production industry and had been introduced to Anthony. So for those blessed to know him, Anthony is a critical thinker. He's someone who can engage in deep study, absorb knowledge of Scripture and cultural happenings, and he does all this while carrying the heart of Jesus for others. I hadn't met anyone exactly like him in all of my years of church going. I grew up in the church, and then obviously as you branch out, you try to find a church home to call your own, but I hadn't ever met someone like that. And then our church that we had been attending was going through some internal issues, and so we just thought it'd be nice to come here for a few weeks, let Anthony see our face in the sanctuary. And that was like 6 years ago, and we've been here ever since. Anthony's heart drew us in, but the heart of the larger church has kept us. And so I wanted to really start by just thanking you guys. We do this, or we have this phrase here that we like to say, which is doing life together. And I just want to remind you all of the depth of that statement. In truly God-centered relationships, the strength doesn't come from perfect people in perfect harmony. It comes from hearts that value the hearts of others, even with the knowledge of their flaws or differences of opinion. What we do here is not easy, but it's worth it. And so I just wanted to lead with that encouragement and a thank you, because, you're doing life with Abby, myself, Flynn, and then this next kiddo that'll be here in a matter of 4 or 5 weeks. So I think I buttered you up appropriately. I have done a decent amount of public speaking, but the closest I've come to this type of setting is I officiated a couple of friends' weddings, and everybody that's attended those weddings loved them, because the time I estimated it would take ended up cut in half, which just got everybody geeked up. So if you have a roast on at home or whatever, a football game waiting, you'll be fine. But when I was asked to speak, it was already on the tail end of some serious reflection I'd been having about a few prominent testimonies in my life. And what I like about hearing testimonies is that they can be immediately used if it just happens to align with something similar that you might be going through in your life. Or maybe there's nothing going on in the moment that mirrors exactly what that testimony is outlining, but I think it can be put in the back pocket and drawn from later. I think a rightly told and a rightly used testimony feels to me a little bit like a cheat sheet to life. It's expedited learning, it's expedited personal growth, but more than anything, it provides tangible evidence of God's work in someone's life. Luke 8:39 says, "Return to your home and declare how much God has done for you." This is what Jesus said to the formerly demon-possessed man after he asked to remain with Jesus. Jesus felt safe to him. And why wouldn't he? Jesus had quickly ended what had been long-term suffering. It's like some of my wife's patients. She's an in-home physical therapist, and she'll often be with the same patients for weeks or months, following things like strokes, accidents, surgeries, and so on. Her mission in that time is to show them how to return to a form that allows independence apart from her physically being there. Often these patients get nervous knowing their time with Abby is limited. They feel safe when she's around. But while she can't stay forever, the knowledge, principles, advice, and tools are to remain, to be drawn from moving forward. And that's why Jesus sent the man back to his village. He was to serve as tangible evidence to those back home that God is indeed working. And that is my hope for today after sharing these couple of testimonies. You folks make up my village, and so I sincerely hope that this is helpful for you. I'm going to take a drink. Is the gulp going to be heard by everybody? We'll see. I'm that kind of guy that does the big at the end too, so I had to stop that. So my first testimony here, I'm going to give two, but this first one is about giving. And I need to make it very clear, the elders did not ask me to get up and share this message, challenging you. In fact, I hope that they get as uneasy about it as anyone, because I want to not only end up using this testimony as an encouragement for you all to participate in kingdom work and what God is doing, but as an encouragement for the elders to even more confidently pursue our partnerships. This is so that we can think, dream, and plan in full expectation of a church body that gives as though we are one in heart and soul. That's from Acts 4:32, and Anthony actually covered that verse in more detail last week. And I'm going to be jumping back and forth a little bit, back into my childhood, and it was really fun writing this sermon because I got to really think and remember about some things that were pretty formative for me from my younger days. And I just kept having this lady named Penny Harrison on my mind. She was someone that we went to church with when we were younger, and I knew I had this story, and I thought it could relate, but I just couldn't figure out exactly where it fit, and so I ended up just cutting it. And then as I was falling asleep last night, I was like, dude, Acts 4:32, this is going to fit perfect. And then not only did I fit Penny Harrison in, but also a second story. So I guess this is the life of someone who writes sermons. So as I started to realize that I wanted to share this giving testimony and Acts 4:32 came up, Penny Harrison was just at the forefront of my mind. She was kind of like our version at the time of an Amy Gordon. She would stop by our house about once a month and drop off a box of food. Crackers, cookies, mac and cheese, canned goods, etc. See, I didn't know it growing up because our parents shielded us from it quite well, but money was tight and groceries were expensive. So Penny Harrison did what she could to help a young family out. I was always excited to see what was in that month's box. My older brother and I would rifle through it, taking out the best stuff first, and then we would go to youth group or school or sports practice and ask other kids what they had gotten in their Penny Harrison food box. And they'd look at us like, what are you talking about? Who's Penny Harrison? What food box? You see, Penny was a member of our church, and she oversaw this food program. Well, my older brother and I, we honestly didn't know where the church began and where the church ended. We thought that every single family got a food box from Penny Harrison. And this really reminds me of that verse from Acts. Our young minds were so into the church, and it was serving us so intimately that, like I said, it was just normal to us to have our needs met like that. And so I think often about Penny Harrison and that a simple act for her could become such a natural part of our lives in the church. And then another quick story that kind of mirrors this same sacrifice, unselfishness, or giving, is that my older brother graduated college when I was a senior in high school. And after he did, he had the opportunity to go play professional basketball overseas in Germany. And it was very, very exciting. He took that opportunity, but to my mom, that was really hard because it meant nearly a year at a time without seeing her eldest boy. We are a very tight family, and that was a long time to go without seeing each other. And there was not room in the budget for flights that far. So we would just call him when we could and then plan to see him next summer. But then later that year in our mailbox was a check. And that check was to be specifically used for one set of round-trip tickets for my mom, my dad, and myself. So I got to spend spring break of my senior year with my older brother, one of my heroes and my best friends. My parents would use their ticket on a separate trip, so I literally got to bum around Germany with my older brother, eating street food, exploring historic sites, and talking like we used to when we were kids. It's one of my best memories. My parents never asked for that financial support to fly and see their son. But that didn't prevent a lockstepped church member from having it impressed on their heart to give. Someone in that church understood the longing in a family's heart and took action. I didn't get emotional when I was rehearsing. So I think that most Christians go through struggles with giving. They'll ask themselves questions like, when, how much, does my heart really need to be in it? Does God really need it? Maybe the person next to me can handle the giving. They're probably in a more stable financial situation. I went through every single one of these questions. I spent years on each question. But in shaping this testimony of giving, I was reminded again of when I was a kid. I had just been given a crisp $10 bill for my 10th birthday. And around this same time, I had begun to wonder what was up with the envelope that my parents would put in the offering plate each month at church. It was then that they explained their principle of tithing 10%. My grasp of percentages was lacking, so I thought this meant that I needed to tithe $10. My mom tried her best to explain that 10% did not mean $10, and that if I was in fact following their 10% principle, then I only needed to give $1. But $1, that wasn't 10. So I gave it all, not realizing that by giving my $10 that I thought was 10%, I had actually given away 100% of my net worth. But I didn't care. I was a kid, so I gave joyfully. Somehow, as I started to earn for myself and birthday checks didn't cover the cost of a mortgage, I lost my desire to give. I lost my humility as a giver. I wanted control over every single dollar. And this was really problematic when my wife and I had trouble finding a church to commit to full time. I just said, why would I give to an entity that I didn't really know anything about, that I didn't know if I could trust, that I wasn't committed to? I didn't know if they were committed to me. The shift in giving has been a long and painful process that God has continued to walk me through graciously. Once we found CLG, I began to feel the nudge to give. And my response to the nudge was still far from my reaction as a child, but I did give. I often gave intermittently in amounts that failed to test my faith. When we had extra cash, I would go to clgonline.org/give, and with clenched teeth, I would give. There was no consistency at all, but at least I was doing something, I thought. The further refinement came when I just continued to feel it impressed upon me to give more. And that 10% kept just ringing in my head. My parents gave the 10% faithfully for decades, even when money was tight. And to be honest, I don't know whether that 10% is supposed to be the floor of what we give or the ceiling. It's just, I don't know. But that 10% to me really stuck out. And so over the course of time, I was able to implement a system in which 10% of our earnings went out of the bank the same day that our paychecks would hit. And this was a great system for achieving consistency. But I still had that clenched jaw. After all, now being an adult, I could very easily subtract 10% from my earnings and think of all the other things I could have done with that money. The money was going where it needed to, but I still felt bitter. The thing about bitterness I've learned is that it can coincide with satisfaction. I felt a great deal of satisfaction when I would give, but I was bitter about having to give. It's kind of like cleaning the entire kitchen out of spite because your spouse made a small mess. Feels good in some ways, but that bitterness is still there. It's not rooted in the right thing. There was more that God wanted from me, and I even knew what it was. He wanted a heart that was postured toward giving, one that was pointed at him when donating, one that was thankful for the opportunity to partner with him in kingdom work. This evolution of giving, it just kept going. And so each morning of payday, I would wake up, subtract the 10%, and sit down and thank God for his provision as I would click send. I would thank him for being a loving father, for always providing, and for dwelling within each of the ministries that Abby and I would give to. This was 100% a fake it until you make it strategy. I faked my joy right up until God supplied the real thing. Not even a few weeks into this strategy of tentative surrender, my heart started to change. I was even excited to give, a bit like my 10-year-old self. And I couldn't believe it. I could feel this shift in my heart. And it was like, dude, you're getting there. The final portion of this story is that within this time frame of Taylor's joy development, we received a letter in the mail from Abby's grandma. And I'm going to get choked up, it's going to be here too. It said that she had been thinking of us and wanted to share a gift. And along with the letter was a check, a nice check. It was the kind of check that provided breathing room at a time that we needed it. And Abby and I just leaned on the table, just looking at each other, just wept. God was working within our story. And so I want to be clear. This is not an endorsement of the prosperity gospel, but it is an endorsement of allowing God to shape you into a joyful giver. I cannot promise a check in the mail reimbursing you for faithful giving, but I can promise that a joyful heart is better positioned to receive and understand God's blessings back to you. Psalm 37:4 says, "Delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart." This verse does not insinuate a blank check or a winning lottery ticket. It outlines the value of transformation, that as we align more closely with God, our desires will more closely match his. And it did take a while, but God was able to subvert the hold that money had on my heart and instead shift my focus to his presence over our finances. That's the end of testimony 1, and I'm going to transition into testimony 2. And this one is about something that I struggled with for a number of years. It was poor sleep. And oddly enough, on the heels of talking about giving and spending, I would have literally paid anything for quality sleep at that time. For a large portion of my adult life, I was a really poor sleeper. It's something I witnessed my dad struggle with when I was younger, which was bouts of insomnia. For me, it often meant stretches of only sleeping a couple hours a night. And I'm not talking about poor sleep related to crying children, because that one there hasn't been an answer for. And I'm well aware I'm entering back into that world again here in a few weeks. So pray for me. But I'm talking about helplessly poor sleep, attributable to everything or nothing. I would stare at the ceiling when I've had a hard day and I know tomorrow's going to be just as hard. Or I would stare at the ceiling when there was absolutely nothing wrong, life was great, I just couldn't sleep. And so short of high-powered medication, I tried everything. I tried not looking at my phone 3 hours before bed. I would turn off all the lights hours before bed. It was like we were living in the Stone Age. I tried exercising, eating right, and reading the most boring books I could find. And actually, I didn't read them. My wife, Abby, read them to me. I would curl up in bed like a giant toddler and listen to her voice of care reading some book. In those moments, her voice was the only bit of peace I could sense. And some of it did put me right to sleep. But I would usually wake up an hour later for the rest of the night. I had no answers, and every sleepless night felt like I was getting closer to fulfilling the vision I had in my head of my dad. He's a kind, godly man but he just couldn't sleep. It legitimately felt like the blessing of sleep was not meant for me. And it was as though I had the desire of a race car during the day, but was running off stale fuel. You see, God wired me to think big, to assume I would be successful more than I would fail. And because I'm a huge basketball fan, it's superior to all other sports. I need to get an analogy in. I think that's another part of writing a message, is that you just have to fit as many analogies as you can. When I played basketball, anytime I would miss a shot, I literally didn't care. My confidence did not waver whatsoever. And the reason it didn't is because I spent hours in the gym honing that craft. And so when you do that and you miss a shot, it's no big deal because you just know the next one's going to go in. Well, if I felt like at that stage of my life, I was at a point where I was supposed to wake up and take these big shots, but I couldn't get time in the gym. And time in the gym in this instance is I just couldn't sleep. I wasn't getting the rest that I needed. And so besides being tired, my self-confidence was eroding. And as it did, I got increasingly angry. I'm talking about the type of anger where it's just all centered right in your forehead. Feels like your head's going to burst. It just gives you a headache. You're so mad. And that seems to be the place that it wants to go. So instead of just tossing and turning, I would spend the nightly hours degrading myself. I would say horrible things about my inability to do a simple, passive activity like sleeping. I was becoming very unkind to myself, and mornings no longer felt full of possibility. I started to question how a sleepless man would be able to be a good husband, friend, son, brother, or run a business. And it was now to the point where I was having to strongly consider sleep medication. And for me, I was very resistant. And I'm not saying I should have been. I'm not anti-medication. But the pursuit of medication for me felt like a full acknowledgement that, Taylor, you're just never going to be a person that has natural, restful sleep. And as I crept closer to scheduling that doctor's appointment, I just finally laid it all out there for God. I explained to him my frustrations, my anger, the hate that I had for myself at night. That much like money, I was having trouble surrendering sleep to him. I wanted him to know I will be so much better of a Christian if I'm well rested. And obviously, it was an imperfect series of conversations. But I was pursuing him and slowly realizing that he had been pursuing me. And as time went on, I continued the healthy habits of preparing myself for sleep. No phone, no TV, no sugar, no caffeine, but I added in talking to God, allowing him to walk alongside me. It was not overnight, but I was beginning to sleep better. I would fall asleep when I intended and wake up much less often in the middle of the night. The fog of exhaustion was lifting. My mood was better. I was more creative. I was able to laugh and have meaningful conversations. And that continued for quite a while, almost to the point where I thought maybe I was through it. Until one specific night when absolutely nothing would work. I just couldn't sleep. I could barely close my eyes long enough to blink. But this time it felt different. It felt like God himself had inserted an IV of Red Bull into my arm and whispered, Taylor, go to the couch. We need to talk. I got up out of bed and went to the couch. I didn't waste those few hours tossing and turning like I had in the past. I heard him loud and clear. I said, all right, let's do this. And it was there that for the rest of the night, legitimately, I listened and talked with God, but it was from a place of peace. I was able to more adequately understand that God had an even deeper level of healing for me than I could imagine. What I thought was just a case of struggling to catch consistent Z's was a case of deeply rooted anxiety. Anxiety over what impacts a lack of sleep would have on my brain when I'm older. Anxiety over not being able to perform. Anxiety over lacking the energy to chase my dreams. Anxiety over fulfilling an identity that I knew God did not desire for me. We covered it all that night. And as morning approached, I couldn't help but feel God telling me a few different things. And these are some of the things that he said. He said, even when you don't have rest, I'm still here. He said, my presence is more restful than 8 hours of sleep. And he told me, tomorrow night, you will return to sleep, but this time you'll know that anxiety has no place. So he gave me rest for those few months, but then he really dropped the bomb, and he started to root out the reason for my restlessness. You see, he didn't want me just relying on healthy habits, although I do still do a lot of those things. He wanted reliance on the peace that only he can give. And to this day, I don't count sheep. I often fall asleep repeating the phrase, I love you and I trust you. I love you and I trust you. And my wife can attest, I sleep like an absolute rock, unless a baby is crying. These testimonies have been on my heart for the past few years, and I've only repeated them to a select few people. Anthony, my family, I think I've shared some of this with my buddy Carter. I know there is power in testimony, and I hope that there is power in mine. And as I try to parse through these stories and find a theme, it's that the needed changes came when I decided to cooperate with God and allow him the room to grow me. And that's actually what I'd like to explore a little further in Message Plus, if you guys would care to join. Message Plus is kind of the 45-minute-ish session. I think it usually starts at 11:15, in which those who'd like to stick around can, and we just discuss the message. But what I'd like to direct it towards today is just an opportunity to share your own testimonies of times that you've had to cooperate with God. Maybe unexpected moments of healing, whether that was healing that took a long time or immediate healing, or even areas where we're still struggling. And in trying to mirror Anthony, he's usually pretty good about leaving us with a challenge. And so I'd like to do that same thing. So perhaps like me, you're struggling to determine where and when to give. Please don't run from that struggle. Find that line of discomfort in your mind and cross it. Just cross it. And elders, here's looking at you. Be bold in your planning, in your forecasting, in your dreams of what we can do between these walls and outside of these walls. I want you all to trust that the relational aspect of what you do among the congregation is strong enough to withstand financial asks. We love you, we trust you. Come get it. Or maybe you're at your wit's end and you're struggling with something. The kind of struggle that you just can't leave behind, that you can't ignore. Maybe it feels like God is nowhere to be found. Keep finding the smallest ways to cooperate with God. Don't push the struggle down. Let it bubble to the surface, where you and God can work together in exploring it. He does already have the full picture, but it requires a surrender of some of the things that you hold most firmly. And I hope that these stories serve as an encouragement to have a purposeful pursuit of and partnership with God. And so that was pretty good for a first time, 10:58, wow. I'm gonna pray us out, and Julie, will you be up front afterwards? So Julie's gonna come up front, and she'll be available to pray with anybody after the service who would like that, or grab a trusted person next to you and pray with them. God, I just thank you so much for your presence here. There are what feels like just this fresh mixing in the air here. There's the same people that have served faithfully for decades, but there's new faces all the time. And I just find that to be so exciting. And I pray that between those who have been here for a long time and those who are new, that our testimonies would just permeate this space and permeate our relationships with one another. That we would encourage, challenge, and refine one another in a way